Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation, Getting the Gist of CJIS 5.9.5. My name is Melissa Russell, and I'll be the host for today's session. Before we begin, I did want to let you know that we are recording this session, and we will be sending out a link to the recording as well as a link to the slides, probably in the next day or so. At this time, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speaker. I am joined here today by Adam Witczek, who's our principal engineer here at Eclipsium, and he will start guiding you through the presentation. Adam, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, Melissa. All right. Hi, everybody. As Melissa mentioned, my name's Adam Wojak. Just a little bit about me first. I've spent about 25 years in the IT and security industry doing various different, hardware, software, virtualization integrations. Been particularly interested in emerging technology, security, anything that really involves automation and efficiency improvements. And I've worked as an engineer for quite a while now for device OEMs, software companies, and that's afforded me the ability to, work collaboratively, hands-on with many customers, solving these kind of problems. So that's really what I love to do. So up here on the screen, I know we're all security focused, but feel free to scan the QR code. That's just a link to my LinkedIn profile. You can connect with me. Happy to chat with anybody offline about any questions you might have. So today the agenda is really to talk about CJIS and really what's new in 595. There's not a ton of updates in 595, so I'm going to kind of review some other security controls and et cetera as well. But the agenda, I guess, as we look at this, is we'll talk a little bit about the overall CJIS security policy modernization, what's new in 595. I'm going to take a little bit of a step back and kind of define what firmware is, because after that, I'm going to deep dive into some specific security controls, going to kind of focus on firmware, device and component level security. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how Eclipsium can help you meet some of these security controls. And then we'll just do a quick recap. If we have a minute or two, maybe some Q&A, feel free to drop any questions in the chat as we go, and I'll try to address those at the end. So CJIS 595 security policy. As I mentioned, I just kind of wanted to talk about the modernization effort first. So I know this has been going on for a long time, but really 592 was kind of a monumental moment. December 7th of 2022, the CJIS policy almost doubled. I think there was about a 40% increase in just the number of pages in the CJIS security policy at that moment, at that release, right? And there were some major enhancements as far as encryption standards, auditing requirements, really systems integrity, and many of those kind of things. So we'll focus on a few of those today after we talk about what's new. So first off, as you go through the security policy, I'm not providing this in the order that it is in there. I kind of prioritized it, what I think is most important. And I was happy to see in version 595 that really the APB went through and basically assigned priorities and implementation markings for each of these security controls. So if you're not familiar with it, what it really means to you is now you have kind of a roadmap for what's most important and what you need to address first. So there's really three designations, and those are existing. So anything that was existing prior to the modernization or is marked as existing. And then there's a priority one designation that's actually kind of treated the same as existing, right? It's something very critical that needs to be in place today. If you look here, these were basically defined as sanctionable requirements as of the beginning of October. So October 1, 2024, we're now obviously on the back side of that, and all these things should be in place. Other priorities are priority 2, 3, and 4. They all really fall into the same category. They fall into what's known as a zero cycle, and this began at the beginning of October as well, and it ends in September 30th, 2027. So you really have almost 3 years at this point still to address those items. So this should just help you kind of figure out what you should address in what order and what kind of priority to assign to those things. Other updates in 595, so section 5.7 configuration management, or for short CM. There were a number of updates here. I I handpicked kind of a few of these that I'm going to talk about. So those are going to be baseline configuration, configuration settings, and system component inventory. There's some others here that I have not highlighted that you may want to go back and specifically review. And again, the policy guide PDF link is there if you don't know how to find it. Lastly, I won't be touching much on this one, but it is a change and I wanted to just bring it to your attention if you're not aware. So section 5.6, identification and authentication. I know most agencies have been working on multi-factor authentication, two-factor authentication requirements, improving authentication. So this was just an update to this. Basically, all this did was sunset basic password standards. So that sunset actually occurred on September 30th, 2024. So again, we're on the back side of that. You should have anything that fell under the basic password standards basically cleaned up and removed at this point. Again, you can go find more detail in the policy guide. So as I mentioned, I was going to talk a lot about firmware. So I just kind of want to define what firmware is first, right? So I said earlier, I've been in the industry 25 years. I used to build my own systems and such, right? So many of us think of BIOS or as firmware as basically the BIOS or nowadays what we would call the UEFI on the system board. I think we also know that it's much more than that nowadays, but just like to call to attention the fact that a computer these days is really a constellation of compute devices. So you have all these chips either on the main board or connected via sockets and peripheral interfaces that are basically requiring firmware or microcode of some sort to operate. We also have, these out-of-band management solutions that are basically full stack operating systems that we refer to as firmware that need maintained and patched and et cetera as well. So just kind of wanted to highlight, what we're talking about here in terms of firmware. So getting into the security controls, the first security control family I wanted to talk about is SI, System and Information Integrity. There's four that I kind of pulled out here, and that's SI2 flaw remediation, SI3 malicious code protection, um, SI4 information system monitoring, and SI7, probably the most important here, software, firmware, and information integrity. And I'm going to drill down into each of these in a little more depth. So what I tried to do here was highlight the priority for you. Actually, everything that I'm going to drill down into today is either going to be existing and or priority one. I will talk about high level about a couple other ones that don't fall into that category. But flaw remediation, the real change here is, we've had flaw remediation requirements for a while now. Those mostly address software applications, host operating system level. But you can see I've highlighted that firmware updates really fall into this now, right? So if you read on from the time a vendor releases an update, it needs to be applied in the correct amount of time. So if it's a critical update, that's 15 days, and then progressively down to a low that provides you 90 days to update. I don't know how many of you attend, like say the IJIS Institute CJIS updates that the FBI CJIS team puts on, Chris Weatherly and team. But, one of the messages I hear out of there is, patch, 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 patch early and patch often. They really hammer that home. And they also, make a point that the CJIS policy is really a minimum set of guidelines, right? You can do much more than this, but you can't really do any less than what's defined in the policy. SI3 malicious code protection. So, I'm sure you're doing a lot of this today, again, at the application, the OS layer. You have tools in place to do this, to automatically detect any kind of malicious code, performing periodic scans. You can see here, it's actually specifying that periodicity is daily. And then providing the ability to block, quarantine, or otherwise take mitigating actions when anything is identified. So again, fairly standard. Just want to bring to your attention that this should also be applying to lower level components, devices where there's code running as well. SI4 is just information system monitoring. Pretty standard stuff here. Again, it's a priority one. We need to monitor a system automatically to detect these kind of things. So we'll talk a little bit about what we can do as far as malicious code protection, vulnerability scanning, auditing and maintaining records, and then, network and firewall monitoring as well. And again, I feel like SI7 is an extremely important one. This was definitely new back in 592 when this was introduced as far as the firmware is required. So we just noted the firmware, and then they actually have the FBI has included a definition of firmware here, and they're really calling out firmware interfaces, including the UEFI, the Unified Extensible Firmware Interface, and BIOS in the case if you're still using BIOS. Again, other components that are driven by microcontroller firmware should fall into this as well. So that's really it for the SI section, the system information and integrity. And then, as I mentioned previously, I just wanted to also touch on the configuration management security control family. So there were updates in 595 to this section. So I'm going to talk about CM2 baseline configuration, CM6 configuration settings, and CM8 system component inventory. I think you'll see as we go through these are very kind of commingled in my opinion. There's a lot of crossing of the requirements here. They could almost be blended together. But again, existing priority one for baseline configuration. So this is requiring that you develop, document, maintain a configuration control and a baseline configuration of your system. And this is really because, if you have any kind of event or incident, you really need to know what the normal state, the secure state of the system was prior to that event, right? Help you determine after an event what the blast radius may be, what the impact is, whether you've returned that device back to the previous state or not. So that's an area we'll talk a little bit more about in a bit as well. Configuration settings. So again, priority one, just again, sounding very similar, right? But establishing and documenting your configuration settings. And note that it's saying here for components employed within the system, right? So this is kind of indicating that you need to do this to a pretty granular level, going down within the system and the settings for each of the various components. And then you also need to monitor control changes. You need to have change control in place for those kind of configuration settings and to be able to tell when they have changed. I didn't highlight it here, but there are recommendations as far as like STIGs, CIS benchmarks, and et cetera as well that you may want to read more into. And then lastly, under CM, it's really the system component inventory. So they're just mentioning you need to really develop your inventories down to the component level of the device. You need to understand what's in those devices, the integrity of those components. I find it interesting that they're actually only suggesting a review and update of the component inventory annually, but you can easily do so much more often. And why would you not want to kind of exceed that requirement? So again, I highlighted this is going to include hardware and firmware, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And risk assessment. This is so the security control family risk assessment, or RA. We'll talk about RA5 vulnerability monitoring and scanning. I would imagine most of you have something in place today for this. You have a network vuln scanner or whatnot. At Eclipsium, we can basically take the vulnerability scanning down level into the components, enumerate those vulnerabilities to specific components of devices, help you to view your inventory at that level, right? So if you wanted to see how many devices have a specific component that may have a vulnerable code or just vulnerable version of the hardware or whatnot, we can easily help you to identify those kind of things. And that's going to be, a deeper analysis than what you're getting out of most of those existing vulnerability scanning tools today. So just to kind of recap all of those security controls, again, these are the priority one or existing controls. I just designated them all as priority one here, but you can see just a list here of all of those that you should actually already have a solution in place for. I obviously talked to a lot of agencies, and many are still addressing most of these, I shouldn't say most of these controls, but some of these controls. And so we'll talk about, how we can assist you in that. And then just to highlight a few of the lower priority ones that I didn't want to just drill down into. But at a high level, SA22 unsupported system components. This is basically just saying your devices should be under mainstream support. The components should also still be supported. Your vendors, you should be able to have a warranty or service contract with them. They should be providing patching and updates. If those things aren't happening, aren't offered, or aren't in place, you really need to be replacing those devices. And then MA3 maintenance tools. This is a very broad category, but we really look at it from the perspective of those out-of-band management tools that fall under this category, right? So I think I kind of mentioned earlier, like on your server infrastructure, your baseboard management controllers that are providing that out-of-band access, your Intel ME chipsets and AMTs, whether you're actively using those as part of your management, they exist in those devices. So are you taking actions to mitigate, patch, and control those and basically prevent that attack vector from being used? So how can Eclipsium help and what do we do? So Eclipsium is a supply chain security platform for your IT infrastructure. So when I say that, I would like to define, we're really covering three asset classes. Your end user compute devices, so think your desktops and laptops, your server infrastructure, and then really your networking appliances or fabric of the network. So switches, routers, access points, firewalls, load balancers, internet gateways, those kind of things. Those are all the devices that we're doing these assessments for. We kind of break that down into these three pillars here at the bottom. That's your inventory, harden, detection, and response. So inventory, I think I've kind of alluded to prior. We're doing a very deep level inventory of your devices, looking down to the component level, what code versions are running in that component level, and assessing all of those things. So even though you have a inventory today, it may not be going down to that level. We can certainly complement existing inventories or just provide a deeper level inventory for you to review. Hardening is a number of things, right? We're looking for security misconfigurations on devices at this lower level, right? So BIOS, think of things like BitLocker, virtualization-based security, direct memory access and such. We're identifying vulnerabilities and we're mapping them to those components. And then we also have a feature we call automated firmware update where we're going to take care of some of this patching for you. We know what devices you have in your network. We're going to find and stage the firmware available, and we're going to help you to streamline the updates of that firmware. And then lastly, and probably most importantly, is detection and response, right? So if there's already been any kind of malicious activity, then you have some sort of indicator of attack or compromise we can find. We'll identify things such as UEFI, rootkits, bootkits, any kind of malicious implant in that lower level code. We do that through a number of methods. We can certainly talk about that in more depth in like a demo. I want to keep it kind of high level today. But that's just a quick overview. So, excuse me. So we look at this as, what are the attack surfaces of your devices today? If we look at everything in blue here, the host operating system application layer, I know it's not shown here, but I always add kind of the file system, virtualization layer. Those are pretty well covered by existing tools today. And I think you'd say it for the most part, most of those tools are doing a pretty good job. However, there's this whole hidden attack surface that I've been kind of talking about, which is, chipsets, processors, your boot firmware, your UEFI and BIOS, and then really all the component level code of these devices. So it's possible for malicious code to basically escape the application layer and be implanted or written to the lower level. And once it's there, those existing tools don't really have the ability to find and see them at that level, right? So we just kind of draw this line of delineation that your EDRs and XDRs are happening at that upper level today, and Eclipsium's platform and solution is looking at the lower level. So very complementary services. We're not replacing your existing security tools. They work well together, and really they're both necessary. So at what point in the life cycle of your devices do we come into play? I would say really the CJIS requirements are requiring what's here on the right side, and that's continuous regular assessment of your devices, the patching and management of those devices. But we also have the ability on the left side to run, basically do a supply chain analysis, if you will, right? When you first receive a device, are you receiving that device in a secure state exactly as the manufacturer configured and intended it? Does it require any kind of updates to be secure beforehand? So kind of combining those two, you can create a zero trust scenario for enterprise hardware. I would also add, not only new hardware, but if you buy any kind of secondary hardware, it would be even more probably important to analyze that hardware before you add it to your network. So just real quick, like how our platform works and how we do this. Um, so again, I talked about those asset classes really for EUC server and networking devices. We can do either a agent-based scan or a agentless remote scan. So EUC is really always going to be an agent-based scan. We're going to install an agent in the device that's going to give us very rich information, low noise, very high fidelity information about the device. In the case of server infrastructure, we can sometimes do that depending on the operating system, or we may do agentless remote scans using, say, like Redfish over the BMC, or even just interfacing with an SDK, like in the case of a hypervisor, like a vSphere or something like that. And then with networking devices, we're always going to do agentless remote scans. So we would essentially have a node within your network that's designated as a scanner, and it's going to reach out to those devices and collect the information it needs. Lastly, here you see kind of an IoT device, a camera here. We can do image-based analysis. And the reason we kind of show this one different is because we don't continuously collect information from that device. It would be kind of a offline analysis. So you simply provide the image for those devices through our console, upload them, and we run them through our analytics engine and provide information back on them. So I want to point out, we separate the collection of information from the analysis of the information. So all these things here are kind of showing how we collect the data from the device. To actually analyze information and provide you the security details, we're going to send those archives off to a dedicated remote cloud instance that's stood up for you on your behalf. There's no, it's a single customer instance. There's no cross-pollination. All the analytics, the heavy crunching is really going to happen there, and the database is hosted there, the front end's hosted there. So basically you'll have a console to access all that information, APIs and webhooks and et cetera, syslogging to get that data out to other systems like your SIM and SOAR systems. Um, Once it's basically gone through the analytics engine, you're going to get back detailed information about the device. Really, it's going to provide you, visibility into your deeper visibility into your devices, assessment information, and actionable insights. So I've talked a lot about kind of device integrity. I guess I just want to kind of point out one of the main ways we do this is we have a database. We call it a firmware and reputation database, over 14 million objects now. So as we extract firmware and binaries from your devices and we hash them and analyze them, we can compare them to that database and determine whether this is something that's actually known to have been released from a vendor and all the hashes match and those kind of things. Again, we'll look up vulnerabilities for each of those code levels, and we're not just using an API or something to ask what version of firmware is running. We're actually extracting that and verifying it and then doing the vulnerability lookup based on what we've determined that code to be. We can monitor for changes. We can set baseline integrity configurations, right? So you can configure a device the way you want it and then say, I want to be notified if there's been any changes. You can also do one-to-many configurations, right? Where you say, this is kind of my gold standard device, and I have these 1,000 other laptops that are the exact same model and should be configured the same way. And if any of them don't match this baseline, I want to be notified. And then I also talked, I think, about automatic firmware updates earlier. So again, we're just going to pull that information from the vendors. We're going to stage it for you in your instance based on what you have in your inventory. And then we'll just make it very simple for you to deploy that through our agent on the device. And the real value there is that's vendor agnostic, right? So you don't have to use all the various vendor tools. You can simply use Eclipsium across all your different devices. So just a quick kind of remark from one of our customers, this Tim Lisco at DigitalOcean. He's just pointed out that establishing and verifying the roots of trust in your IT infrastructure is very difficult. I mean, this is a large organization that has the resources to probably figure this out on their own, but he really appreciated the Eclipsium platform and the simplification of that process that we were able to provide. So, you know, we can do that at scale for any size customer at this point. Um, so just to recap real fast, we talked about a little bit of the updates in version 5.9.5. There's not a significant number of updates, so we drilled into some other things, but those updates are also or they are the priority designations. Again, that existing P1, you know, October 1st, 2024, and then P2, P3, and P4, you really have until October of 2027. We talked a little bit about configuration management and the security control family being modernized there. I brought to your attention the identity and authentication. Not a lot of detail there, but basically the basic password standards have been sunset. Understanding your firmware security requirements, right? Just patch, you know, and make sure that's including your system and component firmware. Verify your system integrity, make sure you have something in place to do that, including hardware and firmware, and establish and monitor system inventories, baselines, and config management, right? So again, CJIS security policy is a minimum set of requirements. You really need to be addressing anything that's in these security controls. And, you know, I just like to point out that Eclipsium can help you meet and automate these security controls that I've talked about today. So I actually don't see any questions at the moment, so I will end it there, but I just wanted to say thank you. And if you would like any more information, you could certainly go to eclipsium.com/demo, fill out the form. We'll reach back out to you and provide you more detailed information or answer any questions.
Thank you, Adam. And I do want to thank everyone again for taking some time out of their day to join us. We will be sending out a link to the recording as well as a link to the slides. And we hope to see you on our next webinar. Thank you very much.